Hi, I'm Christina from Proverbs 31 Homestead. Today I'd like to show you how to can pork. This happens to be a pork butt, or sometimes that's called a pork shoulder. You could also use country ribs, which are simply cuts from the pork butt. This is from one of the newer Ball canning books, and they call it roast pork in spicy broth. And the idea is you end up with something that you can turn into, what would you call these? Tacos, burritos, you could put it in a salad, something like that. So basically it is a meal in a jar, and it's quite easy. We are going to be using a hot pack method, which means that we are partially cooking the meat ahead of time. When you go out to your butcher shop or your grocery store, you want approximately 3 pounds of pork butt. Now, I just went to Walmart, frankly, and bought some pork butts that had the bone in. I think if I had to do it again, I would try to go for boneless. If you have a really good butcher in your area, I don't, but if you do have a butcher who really knows what he or she is doing, I would go ahead and ask them to cube it up for you into cubes that are about 1.5 inches, approximately. And if they're a really good butcher, you can ask them to take the big globs of fat off of the exterior of the cubes. You are never going to get all the little ribbons of fat. Let me see if I can find a good example of that. Out of the meat. This type of pork has a lot of fat in it. And that is terrific if you're cooking it low and slow, like barbecue, which is how you typically would cook this cut of meat, because that fat is going to get rendered out, sort of melted out, and it's going to leave behind glorious flavor. But with canning, fat is the enemy. The more fat you have in your jar, the less the shelf life of that jar is going to be. So you want to cut off as much fat as possible. But again, there's going to be a little bit. But out of my 2 pork roasts that I cut up, I ended up with this big bowl of fat. Now you could take that and render it, make soap, cook with it. I'm going to give it to my chickens, which will make them really, really happy. And my dog's hoping for a little bit too, but he can't have too much fat. Another thing I probably would do if I had to do it over again, because it took me a while to cut this up. First of all, make sure you have a really sharp knife, which I didn't, bad me. But I think I might go for the country ribs. They're really inexpensive right now, at least in my area. And you can buy them without the bone very easily. And I think it would just be easier to slice them up. They're already in smaller shapes. So something to consider. So the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and partially cook, in this case bake, the meat. You don't want to cook it all the way through because canning, pressure canning, because we're doing meat, is going to finish cooking it. So the first thing I'm going to do is put the pork on foil-lined baking trays, the type with a rim on them. You want it in a single layer, and then we're just going to season the meat. Now, an important thing to know if you're a canner is that with seasoning, you have some discretion. It is always safe to use dry seasonings, especially if a recipe already calls for dry seasonings when canning. You don't want to substitute dry for fresh. For example, don't use fresh basil instead of dried, because that can change the density of the food in the jar, which can mean that it doesn't get heated thoroughly, which can mean that you end up with food that's not safe to eat. But the recipe calls for 4 teaspoons of salt and 1/2 teaspoon of pepper. You could do less than that. You could totally omit the seasonings if you wanted to, although the meat might be kind of bland tasting. You could also potentially add more seasoning. The only thing you need to be careful about if you're adding more dried seasoning, in this case more salt, more pepper, or maybe some other dried seasonings. The seasonings can be intensified after the food goes through the canner, and some seasonings can even take on sort of a bitter flavor. So, you know, you have to use some common sense and maybe look at amounts in other recipes, other approved canning recipes. Maybe experiment with just one jar so that you don't lose a whole canner load of food because you can't stand the way it tastes. This recipe also, I think, suggested using canola oil. We're gonna put oil on the meat and then season it. I would never in a million years use canola oil because I think it's a really unhealthy oil. I tend to stick to oils that are less processed. So I'm gonna use some olive oil. If I didn't have that on hand, I'd probably use avocado oil. We're just gonna drizzle, 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 drizzle. And then, even though I put that on there real neatly, I'm gonna mix it up. Okay, the oil is all on my meat. Now, I'm always gonna do salt first. Salt is always best closest to the meat. It's what helps sort of dry it out when you're cooking, and it will add better flavor if you do that. I've got 2 trays, so I've got to sort of try to have an even amount on each tray here. And then my pepper, again, even amounts, hopefully. By the way, I have never canned out of this particular ball canning book. I've had it ever since it came out. The recipes just mostly didn't appeal to me, but this one I felt could be really good. This is my first time doing it. If you have a recipe that you love out of that book, tell me what it is, because I'd like to try it out. Now these 2 trays are going to go into a preheated 425-degree oven for 30 minutes. They're just going to be browned when I pull them out. I've changed locations, and you might be wondering, why, crazy lady? Well, I have 2 reasons. One is that my canning kitchen doesn't have an oven, but the oven and stove in my house runs on a little propane tank, and so canning uses up a ton of propane, so that's why I come down to the canning kitchen, which is the original, very rustic building on our property that already had water and electricity. So anyway, that's why I've changed location. So my meat has come out of the oven after half an hour, and you will notice that there will be quite a bit of liquid in the baking tray. You may use that liquid for this recipe, but if you do, I highly recommend that you allow it to sit overnight and allow that fat to rise to the top. Scrape that fat off before using it. And the reason for that is, you know, when you're cooking that meat with all that fat in it, a lot of that liquid is actually liquefied fat. And again, we don't want tons of fat in our canning jars. So I would probably save that for the next time you do this recipe, because we ideally want to take that meat right out of the oven and put it into jars. We want the meat warm when it goes into jars. So because I have to bring everything down here, I just covered my trays with foil, and now I'm making the broth that is going to go in the jars with the meat. And that is just a mixture of 2 quarts of chicken broth. Now this can be store-bought broth or homemade broth. If you don't have chicken and you're making your own, you could certainly use rabbit if you've got that access to that on your homestead, or pork if you have access to that on your homestead. Just make sure that if you're using homemade stock or broth, that you, after making it, you put it in the fridge overnight, you let the fat rise to the top and get hard, and you scrape that off. I happen to have some chicken stock that was homemade and in jars, and I just went ahead and used that. So you're using 2 quarts of that. Then you're going to take 1 onion and just slice it thinly, take off the papery skin. And you also need 2 tablespoons of dried crushed red pepper, and 1.5 tablespoons of dried oregano, and 3 garlic cloves, which you mince. And you're just going to put that all in a pot and bring it to a boil. Oh, and by the way, if I look like I'm glowing, it's because when I'm filming in here, I can't have all the fans on, but it's really hot in here today. The things I do for you. That broth has come to a boil, so now I'm going to fill the jars with meat. This is to give you an idea of the brownness level when they come out of the oven. We want to leave 1-inch headspace. And then we ladle over the broth with all those yummy onions in it. I may have overdone it a little. I definitely did. That's okay. Alright, then we're going to bubble. Just trying to get out as many air bubbles as we can. It's going to make the food last longer on the shelf. And then we're going to do a really good job of wiping this rim. I've put a little white vinegar on this paper towel, and that will help get any fat off. Because anything that's stuck to that is going to prevent a good seal. Put a lid on. And a jar ring, and put it in the canner, and then do the next jar. I had just a little bit of meat left over, not enough even for a full pint jar. I've been doing quarts, but I'm going to go ahead and can it in this smaller jar with a little bit more liquid. Remember the rule in canning. It's always acceptable to go down a size, but use the higher processing time. But it's never acceptable to go up a jar and guess at what the processing time would be. So I ended up getting 2, 4, 5 quarts and 1 pint of meat. I put the lid on the canner. Now I'm going to wait until I can see steam venting out of it. I'm going to let it vent for 10 minutes. Then I can put the rocker gauge on it. See, the canner is now steaming. We're going to let that steam for 10 minutes. The pressure canner is now at about 10 or 11 pounds pressure, so I can begin timing. Hey, I'm back in my kitchen because yesterday the battery in my camera went kaput. So that's okay because the remaining steps were really easy. Once your processing time has been reached, which by the way, if you live at a higher altitude than I do, you're going to need to process it for a longer period of time and at a greater amount of pressure. So if you're unfamiliar with that, go ahead and pick up a recent ball canning book. It will explain that. Or if you don't want to spend money on that, you can go to the National Center for Home Food Preservation website. I'll put the link in the description below the video, and it will explain that for you. So, you've reached your processing time. Turn off your stove. If your canner isn't too heavy, you can kind of move it off of the burner, and you're going to let the pressure come naturally to 0. Once the gauge reads 0, wait 2 to 5 minutes. That's just as an added precaution because you don't want a bunch of pressure still in that canner when you open the lid. Remove the little vent piece. I wait another 5 or 10 minutes and then you can remove the lid. Once you remove the lid, wait another 10 minutes and then remove the jars. And the reason we do all that waiting in between time has to do with the pressure and the jars adjusting to the heat and the pressure in the canner. If you rush things, you're going to end up with jars that siphon. That is to say that the fluids or the contents of the jar pour out, and then you're not going to get sealed jars. So it's important not to rush that process. Then you're going to let your jars sit overnight. Check for a good seal. If you don't have a seal, put it in the refrigerator right away. You may reprocess jars that didn't process correctly, but remember, we're using a hot pack method, and so to make sure that your reprocessing produces safe food, you're going to need to reheat all that food before you put it in the canner again. Now, I have never made this particular recipe before, so I wanted to go ahead and show you what it looked like and give it a taste. This is what it looks like in the jar, and it might look like there's fat pieces in that. It's not. That's actually the onions in it. Now, I've taken just a little bit out and I heated it in the microwave, and I'm going to give it a taste test. But first, let me show you what it looks like. I was a little surprised that the meat didn't look more like pulled pork, but it is a solid chunk. It is very, very tender and flaky. Nice and moist. And when I first bit into it, I thought, well, where's all that heat? It's supposed to be spicy. It is in there, definitely. You can definitely taste those pepper flakes. That's good. If it didn't have those seasonings, I think it would be pretty bland. Ooh, it's pretty spicy. So if you don't like spicy things, you're gonna wanna lower the amount of red pepper flakes in this, but I think that's really good. And once you combine it with some other things, it won't be as strong. So I can definitely see using this as part of a taco, which is what Ball recommends in the book. I could see using it on top of a salad, like sort of a fajita salad. Ball also says you could use this as a soup. I think, whoa, that'd be really yummy with a little sour cream on top. Kind of a spicy soup. I could also see putting this on top of rice or cauliflower rice or maybe even noodles. I think it's pretty darn versatile, and I think I will definitely do this again. That's it for today. Ooh, that's spicy. I like spicy, but man, I got a little bit of that pepper flake in my mouth that was burning. And if you have any questions about this or any homesteading or canning topics, please leave a comment and I will definitely answer your questions. And also remember, I have never canned anything from that particular canning book before, this one. So if you've canned something from it and you think it's great, please leave a comment and let me know, because I'm always looking to expand the repertoire. Thanks a lot, and I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.